History remembers many great conquerors. Some built kingdoms that lasted for generations. Others carved their names into history through bloodshed and fear. But centuries before the rise of Alexander the Great, before Hannibal crossed the Alps, and long before the Roman Empire ruled the Mediterranean, one man changed the course of the ancient world forever. His name was Cyrus the Great. He was not born into an empire. He built one. In the middle of the 6th century BCE, the ancient Near East was a patchwork of powerful kingdoms. The Medes ruled the Iranian plateau. Lydia controlled the wealthy lands of western Anatolia. Babylon stood as one of the richest and most magnificent cities on earth. For generations, these kingdoms competed for power, each believing it could dominate the region. Then Cyrus emerged. What began as the rebellion of a Persian prince soon became something far greater. Through brilliant leadership, calculated diplomacy, and remarkable military skill, Cyrus defeated the Median Empire and united the Persians under his rule. It was the beginning of a new age. But victory only fueled his ambition. With each successful campaign, his confidence grew stronger. The wealthy kingdom of Lydia fell after a swift military campaign, bringing its enormous treasures into Persian hands. Not long afterward, the mighty city of Babylon, protected by towering walls that many believed could never be breached, also became part of his expanding empire. One by one, the greatest powers of the ancient world bowed before him. For many people living at the time, Cyrus seemed unstoppable. Yet his reputation was built on more than military victories. Unlike many conquerors who ruled through terror alone, Cyrus often chose a different path. Cities that surrendered peacefully were frequently spared from destruction. Local customs and religions were respected, and defeated peoples were often allowed to continue their lives under Persian rule. This policy helped transform conquered enemies into loyal subjects, strengthening his empire with every campaign. Still, no one should mistake his mercy for weakness. When diplomacy failed, Cyrus responded with overwhelming force. His armies were among the finest of their age. Well-trained infantry marched in disciplined formations. Skilled cavalry struck with speed and precision. Engineers built roads, bridges, and supply routes that allowed Persian armies to campaign across enormous distances. Every invasion was carefully planned, and every victory made the empire stronger. As the years passed, stories about Cyrus spread across the known world. Merchants carried tales of the Persian king, whose armies never seemed to lose. Travelers spoke of cities that surrendered without a fight simply because they had heard his name. Even rival rulers watched his expansion with growing concern, wondering which kingdom would be next. By now, the Persian Empire stretched farther than anyone could have imagined only a generation earlier. To the west lay the shores of the Aegean. To the south stretched the deserts beyond Mesopotamia. To the east stood lands that few Persians truly understood. For most rulers, such an empire would have been enough. For Cyrus, it was only the beginning. Beyond Persia's eastern frontier lay an immense world of open grasslands, where no permanent cities dominated the landscape. The people there lived differently from the civilizations Cyrus had conquered. They moved with their herds across the endless steppe, following the seasons instead of the boundaries of kingdoms. These nomadic tribes were masters of horseback warfare. They did not wait behind city walls. They did not depend on fixed capitals. They fought where they chose, and disappeared when the battle turned against them. Invading such a people would prove unlike any campaign Cyrus had fought before. Among these tribes was one nation that commanded particular respect, the Massagetae. Their warriors were renowned for their skill, their resilience, and their refusal to submit to foreign rule. Even more remarkable was the person who led them. Not a king, not a prince, but a queen. A ruler whose courage, determination, and leadership would soon place her in direct conflict with the greatest conqueror of her age. Her name was Tomyris. The meeting between Cyrus the Great and Queen Tomyris would become one of the most enduring stories of the ancient world. A story of ambition, deception, unimaginable loss, and a battle that, according to ancient tradition, ended the life of the man many believed could never be defeated. While Cyrus was building the largest empire the world had ever seen, another ruler was rising far beyond Persia's eastern frontier. She did not govern from a marble palace. She did not sit upon a golden throne surrounded by towering walls. Her kingdom had no grand capital that travelers could point to on a map. Instead, her people lived beneath an endless sky, where the horizon stretched so far that the earth seemed to meet the heavens. The wind swept across vast grasslands without interruption, carrying with it the sound of galloping horses and the crackling of campfires that were never meant to stay in one place for long. This was the world of the Massagetae. To the great empires of the south, they seemed mysterious, almost impossible to understand. Greek writers described them as fierce warriors who lived beyond the edge of the civilized world. But to the Massagetae themselves, they were simply a free people, shaped by the rhythm of the land they called home. Life on the steppe demanded strength. The seasons could be unforgiving. Scorching summers baked the plains beneath a relentless sun, while winters swept in with icy winds that froze rivers and turned the open grasslands into a harsh wilderness. Only those who adapted could survive. From childhood, every member of the tribe learned that survival depended on skill rather than comfort. Boys and girls alike learned to ride horses almost as soon as they could walk. They practiced drawing bows while riding at full speed. They hunted across the plains, tracking deer, wild boar, and antelope for days at a time. Every lesson prepared them for a life where danger could appear without warning. For the Massagetae, horses were more than transportation. They were companions, weapons, a source of survival. A warrior without a horse was like a sailor without the sea. Unlike the armies of Persia, which depended on organized formations and disciplined ranks of infantry, the Massagetae fought with speed and mobility. They could ride for extraordinary distances in a single day, striking an enemy before disappearing back into the vast plains. Many invading armies believed they had cornered them. Most soon realized they had been chasing ghosts. The land itself became the Massagetae's greatest ally. An army unfamiliar with the endless grasslands could easily lose its way. Supply lines stretched thin. Water became scarce. Scouts disappeared without explanation. By the time an invading commander realized what was happening, his soldiers were often exhausted before the real battle had even begun. The Massagetae understood every river crossing, every valley, every hill that concealed an approaching force. Generations had taught them that knowledge of the land could defeat an army far larger than their own. Yet what surprised outsiders most was not their way of fighting. It was their view of leadership. Among many ancient kingdoms, power belonged almost exclusively to men. Kings inherited thrones, princes commanded armies. Queens were often expected to remain in the background, serving as political figures rather than military leaders. The Massagetae saw things differently. If someone possessed wisdom, courage, and the respect of the people, they could lead, regardless of whether they were a man or a woman. That belief would change history. Their queen was a woman named Tomyris. Ancient sources reveal only fragments of her early life, leaving much of her story hidden by time. We do not know exactly where she was born or what her childhood looked like. History is often silent when it comes to remarkable women. But what history does reveal speaks volumes. Tomyris had earned the loyalty of her people. Among the Massagetae, loyalty was never given lightly. It could not be inherited simply because of blood. It had to be earned. Every decision a leader made affected the survival of the tribe. A weak ruler could lead thousands to starvation or defeat. A reckless commander could destroy generations of families in a single disastrous campaign. The people followed Tomyris because they believed she possessed the qualities their world demanded. She was decisive. She understood warfare. And perhaps most importantly, she understood her people. Many historians believe she became queen after the death of her husband, who had ruled before her. Rather than allowing rival chiefs to divide the tribe or fight for power, Tomyris stepped forward and assumed leadership. It was no small task. The tribes of the steppe respected strength above all else. Any sign of weakness invited challenge. Yet there is no record of widespread rebellion against her rule. That alone tells us something remarkable. She had their confidence. As queen, Tomyris was more than a political leader. She judged disputes between families. She negotiated alliances with neighboring tribes. She oversaw migrations across the plains as the seasons changed. And when danger approached, she became commander of the warriors who defended their homeland. Unlike rulers who remained safely behind palace walls, Tomyris understood the realities of life on the frontier. She knew the exhaustion of long rides across open country. She knew the uncertainty of watching the horizon for signs of an approaching enemy. She knew that every battle carried a cost, measured not only in victory or defeat, but in fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters who might never return home. Perhaps because of this, she did not seek war, but neither did she fear it. The Massagetae had spent generations defending their freedom. Empires rose and fell beyond the horizon, yet the steppe remained theirs. They had no interest in conquering distant kingdoms. They wanted only to protect the life they already had. It was a life built upon independence. No foreign king dictated their laws. No distant emperor collected their tribute. No occupying army marched across their homeland. Freedom was not merely an idea. It was the foundation of their identity. That was precisely what made them different from nearly every nation Cyrus had conquered. Kings who ruled wealthy cities often calculated the cost of resistance. If surrender meant preserving their wealth and their people, many accepted Persian rule. The Massagetae saw surrender differently. To lose their freedom was to lose everything. They could abandon a camp. They could replace lost herds. They could rebuild after hardship. But once an outsider controlled their homeland, the life they had always known would disappear forever. Tomyris understood this better than anyone. She also understood something else. Far to the south, a king was expanding his empire with astonishing speed. Every year, new reports reached the steppe. Another kingdom had fallen. Another ruler had surrendered. Another people now served the Persian crown. At first, these stories seemed distant. The Persian Empire was enormous, but so was the world. Surely Cyrus would eventually be satisfied. Surely even the greatest conqueror would recognize that no empire could expand forever. But each passing season brought Persian borders closer. The distance separating the Massagetae from Cyrus grew smaller. What had once seemed like another kingdom's problem was becoming their own. Tomyris watched. She listened, and she prepared. Because if the stories about Cyrus were true, it was only a matter of time before the world's greatest conqueror looked beyond his newest frontier and saw the endless steppe waiting beyond it. When that day came, neither ruler could know that their decisions would echo through history for more than 2,000 years. The queen of the grasslands and the king of the greatest empire on earth were moving toward the same destiny. Neither intended to yield. Neither imagined how much the coming conflict would cost. And before a single arrow was fired, before a single soldier crossed the frontier, the first battle would not be fought with swords. It would begin with a proposal that sounded like peace, but concealed the ambitions of an empire. By the time Cyrus turned his attention toward the lands of the Massagetae, he was no longer simply a king expanding his borders. He was the ruler of an empire, unlike anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. Kingdom after kingdom had fallen beneath the Persian banner. Some had resisted and been defeated. Others had surrendered without a fight, believing that joining Cyrus's empire was wiser than opposing it. But the Massagetae were different. They possessed no wealthy capital for Cyrus to seize, no royal treasury overflowing with gold, no massive stone walls to surround and besiege. If Persia invaded, the war would be fought across thousands of miles of open steppe, where the enemy knew every river, every hill, and every hidden trail. Even a commander as experienced as Cyrus understood the risks. This would not be another Babylon. It would not be another Lydia. It would be an entirely different kind of campaign. For perhaps the first time in years, the great conqueror chose not to begin with an army. Instead, he began with diplomacy, or at least what appeared to be diplomacy. One morning, as the camps of the Massagetae stirred to life beneath the rising sun, riders appeared on the horizon, carrying the royal standard of Persia. The visitors came not as soldiers, but as envoys. Their horses were richly adorned. Their clothing reflected the wealth of the greatest empire on earth. And they carried a message from Cyrus himself. The Persian king wished to marry Queen Tomyris. At first glance, the proposal seemed generous. Throughout the ancient world, royal marriages were common political tools. They forged alliances, ended wars, and united rival kingdoms. A marriage between Cyrus and Tomyris could, in theory, bring peace between Persia and the Massagetae without spilling a single drop of blood. To many rulers, such an offer would have been difficult to refuse. Imagine what it meant. The most powerful man on earth was offering to share his throne. To smaller kingdoms, such a proposal could mean security, prosperity, and protection beneath the wings of the Persian Empire. But Tomyris was not just any ruler. She listened carefully. She weighed every word, and almost immediately she understood what lay beneath the polished language. This was not a marriage proposal. It was a conquest disguised as diplomacy. If she accepted, the independence of the Massagetae would slowly disappear. Persian influence would enter her court. Persian advisors would follow. Persian officials would arrive to assist in governing. Before long, decisions that once belonged to the Massagetae alone would be shaped by the interests of Cyrus. There would be no need for armies, no battles, no sieges. The conquest would happen quietly, almost peacefully. History has shown that empires often expanded in more ways than one. Sometimes a kingdom fell because its walls were broken. Other times it fell because its ruler willingly opened the gates. Tomyris had no intention of doing either. According to the ancient historian Herodotus, she rejected the proposal outright. There was no hesitation, no attempt to negotiate, no polite delay while she considered the offer. Her answer was clear. The queen of the Massagetae would not marry Cyrus. She would remain the ruler of a free people. For Cyrus, the rejection was more than a personal disappointment. It was a political setback. He had hoped to secure the eastern frontier of his empire without risking a costly military campaign. Instead, he found himself facing a queen who could not be persuaded by wealth, prestige, or promises of power. Some historians have wondered whether Cyrus genuinely admired Tomyris. Perhaps he respected her strength. Perhaps the marriage proposal served more than one purpose. The truth is impossible to know. The ancient sources leave us with only fragments of the story. What they do make clear is this: whatever personal feelings may have existed, political ambition came first. Neither ruler was willing to surrender authority to the other. For Tomyris, accepting the proposal would have meant abandoning the independence her people had defended for generations. For Cyrus, allowing the Massagetae to remain outside his empire meant leaving an unconquered frontier beyond Persia's borders. Both understood what was at stake. The distance between them was no longer measured in miles. It was measured in principle. Word of Tomyris's decision spread quickly through the Persian court. Some advisors reportedly urged Cyrus to let the matter rest. The empire was already vast. Its borders stretched farther than many believed possible. Surely there were greater challenges than a nomadic kingdom beyond the eastern frontier. But conquest has a way of changing those who achieve it. Success creates confidence. Repeated success can create something even more dangerous: the belief that defeat is impossible. Cyrus had spent decades overcoming every obstacle placed before him. Every enemy who had challenged him had eventually fallen. Every campaign had strengthened the conviction that no kingdom could resist the Persian Empire forever. Why should the Massagetae be any different? Yet there was another reason the eastern frontier mattered. An independent nation beyond Persia's borders represented uncertainty. Nomadic tribes could raid settled lands. Trade routes passing through Central Asia required stability. From the perspective of an empire, uncontrolled frontiers were always a concern. Whether motivated by strategy, ambition, or pride, Cyrus began considering military options. His generals studied maps. Scouts gathered intelligence about the steppe. Messengers carried orders across the empire. Soldiers who had only recently returned from one campaign found themselves preparing for another. Far away, Tomyris was doing exactly the same. She had never trusted the proposal. Now she trusted it even less. A ruler as ambitious as Cyrus was unlikely to accept rejection quietly. She called together her advisors and tribal leaders. They discussed what Persia might do next. Some believed Cyrus would abandon the idea altogether. Others warned that the proposal had merely been the first move in a much larger game. Tomyris agreed with the latter. Peace remained possible, but only if both sides respected one another's independence. She hoped Cyrus would recognize that invading the steppe would cost more than it was worth. She underestimated only one thing: the depth of his ambition. Beyond Persia's eastern frontier, preparations quietly accelerated. Blacksmiths sharpened swords and repaired armor. Horse breeders selected the strongest mounts for the coming campaign. Supply caravans gathered grain, dried meat, arrows, and spare equipment. Engineers inspected bridges and surveyed river crossings. The machinery of empire had begun to move. At the same time, across the endless grasslands, the Massagetae also prepared. Warriors inspected their bows. Families moved vulnerable livestock away from likely invasion routes. Scouts rode farther than ever before, watching every approach into their homeland. The air itself seemed to carry a growing sense of unease. Neither kingdom had declared war. No battlefield had been chosen. No army had crossed the frontier. Yet both sides could feel that history was moving toward an unavoidable collision. There was still one final chance to prevent it. One final message that could spare thousands of lives. Queen Tomyris would send a warning to the most powerful man in the world. It would be respectful. It would be direct. And it would leave Cyrus with a choice: turn back, or face the consequences of invading a people who had never surrendered to anyone. The marriage proposal had failed. Whatever chance there had been for a peaceful understanding between Persia and the Massagetae was slipping away. The silence that followed Tomyris's rejection was, in many ways, more unsettling than an open declaration of war. Neither ruler made the first move, but both were preparing for one. Across the eastern provinces of the Persian Empire, military activity began to increase. Garrisons received new orders. Messengers rode from one province to another without pause. Blacksmiths worked long into the night, forging spearheads, repairing armor, and replacing worn blades that had seen years of campaigning. The empire had done this many times before. When Cyrus decided to march, the entire machinery of Persia moved with remarkable efficiency. Food had to be collected. Pack animals had to be assembled. Thousands of soldiers needed weapons, clothing, and supplies for a campaign that could last months. Every successful invasion depended on careful preparation, long before the first battle was fought. This campaign, however, presented challenges unlike any Cyrus had faced before. His generals gathered around large maps, studying the lands beyond the eastern frontier. There were few cities to mark, few roads to follow, few reliable accounts describing the country ahead. Instead, the maps faded into uncertainty. The farther east they looked, the less they truly knew. The Massagetae lived in a land that refused to fit neatly into the strategies that had defeated Babylon and Lydia. There would be no rich capital whose capture would end the war, no royal palace whose fall would force surrender. Even if the Persian army won one battle, the enemy could simply withdraw deeper into the endless grasslands and continue fighting. Some of Cyrus's advisors recognized the danger. Ancient empires had always struggled against nomadic peoples. The steppe offered almost no opportunity for a decisive victory. An enemy who refused to stand still could exhaust even the strongest army. But Cyrus had spent a lifetime overcoming obstacles that others believed impossible. He had crossed mountains. He had conquered kingdoms thought invincible. He had captured Babylon itself. To him, every new challenge was simply another problem waiting to be solved. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Queen Tomyris was watching events unfold with growing concern. Scouts arrived almost daily. Some brought reports of Persian soldiers gathering near the frontier. Others spoke of engineers surveying rivers and preparing routes for a massive army. No single report confirmed that war was coming. Taken together, however, they painted a troubling picture. Tomyris understood something that every experienced ruler eventually learns. Wars do not begin when armies clash. They begin much earlier. They begin when trust disappears. She gathered the elders of the Massagetae, the tribal chiefs, and the commanders who would lead their warriors if Persia invaded. Round the council fire, they debated what should be done. Some favored launching a surprise attack before the Persians were fully prepared. Others argued that remaining patient would reveal Cyrus's true intentions. Tomyris listened more than she spoke. A good leader, she knew, learns as much from silence as from conversation. When everyone had finished, she finally addressed the council. If there was still a chance to avoid war, they had a responsibility to try. Not because they feared Persia, but because every battle carried a price that victory itself could never repay. Even the greatest triumph leaves families mourning the dead. Fields go untended. Children grow up without parents. Communities spend years recovering from wounds that cannot be seen. Tomyris had no desire to become another conqueror. She wished only to defend the freedom her people had inherited. So she made one final attempt to preserve peace. She sent messengers to Cyrus. They rode across the frontier carrying no weapons beyond those needed for protection during the journey. Their mission was simple: deliver the queen's words exactly as she had spoken them. According to the ancient historian Herodotus, Tomyris's message was calm, respectful, and unmistakably firm. She acknowledged Cyrus's strength. She recognized the greatness of his empire. But she also reminded him that every ruler should be content with governing what already belonged to him. There was no need for unnecessary bloodshed. She urged him to abandon his plans and return to his own lands. The Massagetae had no intention of invading Persia. If Cyrus left them in peace, they would do the same. It was a remarkably reasonable proposal. Neither side needed to lose a single soldier. Neither kingdom needed to suffer. History could have taken a very different path. But Tomyris also understood that peace requires both sides to choose it. So she included a warning, not a threat born from arrogance, a promise born from confidence. If Cyrus crossed into her homeland, she said, the responsibility for what followed would rest entirely upon him. The Massagetae would defend themselves with everything they possessed. They would not surrender. They would not become subjects of the Persian Empire. And if war became inevitable, they would fight until the end. The messengers departed. Days passed, then weeks. At last, they reached the Persian court. One can imagine the scene. The royal hall was filled with nobles, military commanders, and advisors from every corner of the empire. Before them stood the representatives of a kingdom that many Persians had barely heard of. They delivered Tomyris's message without hesitation. No pleading, no trembling. No attempt to flatter the great king, only the words of their queen. For a moment the court fell silent. The decision now belonged to Cyrus. Ancient writers do not record every conversation that followed, but they do tell us that Cyrus consulted those closest to him. Among them was a man whose advice carried exceptional weight. His name was Croesus, the former king of Lydia. Years earlier, Croesus had fought against Cyrus and lost. Rather than executing him, Cyrus had spared his life and welcomed him into his court as a trusted advisor. It was an extraordinary relationship. A defeated king now offering counsel to the man who had conquered him. Croesus knew what it meant to underestimate Cyrus. He also understood that the Massagetae were unlike any enemy Persia had faced. The discussions within the Persian court were intense. Should Cyrus accept Tomyris's offer and avoid an uncertain campaign? Or should he continue east, believing that one more victory would secure the empire's frontier forever? The answer would shape the future of both nations. In the end, ambition proved stronger than caution. Cyrus rejected Tomyris's warning. The campaign would continue. Orders spread rapidly through the empire. The army would march toward the frontier. Bridges would be built across the great rivers that separated Persia from the lands of the Massagetae. Engineers moved ahead of the main force, selecting the best crossing points. Carpenters cut timber. Ropes were woven. Boats were assembled. What had once been a distant possibility was becoming reality. On the opposite side of the frontier, the scouts of the Massagetae watched every movement. Dust clouds on the horizon revealed the approach of thousands of Persian soldiers. The greatest army in the known world was coming. Tomyris received the reports one after another. There was no surprise, only confirmation. She had offered peace. She had offered Cyrus the opportunity to turn back with honor. He had refused. Now there would be no more messages, no more negotiations. The next words exchanged between Persia and the Massagetae would not be spoken by diplomats. They would be spoken by clashing steel, galloping horses, and the cries of warriors on the battlefield. Yet even as the Persian army crossed into unfamiliar territory, Cyrus was not planning to win through strength alone. One of his advisors had proposed a different strategy, a strategy built not on courage, but on deception. And before the greatest battle of the campaign could begin, that deception would claim its first victims. As the Persian army advanced toward the lands of the Massagetae, Cyrus faced a problem that even his greatest victories had not prepared him to solve. He knew how to defeat kingdoms. He knew how to besiege cities. He knew how to force enemy kings into surrender. But the Massagetae offered him none of those opportunities. There were no walls to surround, no capital to capture, no single city whose fall would end the war. If Tomyris refused to meet him in open battle, his army could spend months wandering the endless grasslands, chasing an enemy that seemed to vanish with the wind. For the first time in years, Cyrus was fighting an opponent who could choose when and even whether to fight at all. It was a frustrating position for a commander, accustomed to controlling every campaign. So once again, he turned to his advisors. Among them was Croesus, the former king of Lydia. No one in the Persian camp understood the consequences of defeat better than he did. Years earlier, he had stood where Tomyris now stood, facing the armies of Cyrus, believing he could stop them. He had failed. Now he watched another proud ruler preparing to challenge the Persian king. According to the ancient historian Herodotus, Croesus offered advice that would change the course of the campaign. He argued that defeating the Massagetae through conventional warfare would be difficult. Their horsemen were too mobile. They knew the terrain too well. If Persia tried to chase them across the steppe, the campaign could drag on indefinitely. Instead, Croesus suggested attacking something far less predictable: their habits, their expectations, their confidence. He had heard stories about the customs of the Massagetae. Like many nomadic peoples, they were accustomed to a simple way of life. Their food was straightforward. Their drink was equally modest. Wine, especially the rich, concentrated wine enjoyed in the Persian court, was unfamiliar to many among them. To Croesus, that difference presented an opportunity. If the Massagetae could not easily be defeated by force, perhaps they could be defeated by temptation. Cyrus listened carefully. The proposal was unconventional. It was also risky. But throughout his reign, Cyrus had shown that he valued clever strategy as much as battlefield courage. He approved the plan. Soon, preparations began. The Persians established a large encampment near the frontier, choosing a location that could easily be found by enemy scouts. At first glance, it looked like the temporary headquarters of an advancing army. Rows of tents filled the landscape. Supply wagons stood neatly arranged. Cooking fires burned throughout the camp. Nothing appeared unusual. But hidden within the ordinary appearance of the camp was a carefully designed illusion. The finest food available to the Persian army was prepared. Large quantities of roasted meat were laid out. Fresh bread was stacked in baskets. Bowls overflowed with dried fruits, nuts, and delicacies rarely seen on the steppe. Most importantly, large containers of strong Persian wine were brought into the camp. This was no ordinary soldier's meal. It resembled a royal feast. Once everything had been prepared, Cyrus ordered the majority of his forces to withdraw quietly under cover of darkness. Only a small detachment remained behind. Their task was not to defend the camp. It was to create the appearance of a hurried retreat before slipping away themselves. When dawn broke, the camp appeared almost abandoned. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked as though the Persians had fled in haste, leaving behind valuable supplies. Exactly as Cyrus intended. Not far away, scouts from the Massagetae had been observing every Persian movement. They quickly reported what they had seen. A large Persian camp, minimal defenses, and signs that the enemy had withdrawn. The news spread rapidly. Before long it reached Tomyris. Ancient sources tell us that the queen did not personally lead the force sent to investigate. Instead, command fell to her son. His name was Spargapises. Though history preserves only fragments of his life, one thing is clear. He was trusted enough to command a significant portion of the Massagetae army. That responsibility alone suggests he had already proven himself as a capable warrior. Leading thousands of horsemen, Spargapises rode toward the abandoned Persian camp. His warriors approached cautiously. Every experienced fighter understood that appearances could be deceiving. They searched the area for hidden soldiers. They watched the surrounding hills. They waited for signs of an ambush. But none appeared. The camp seemed exactly what it looked like, deserted. As the warriors moved among the tents, they found something they had not expected. Food. Enough food to feed an army. After days of watching the Persians prepare for war, they now stood inside a camp filled with supplies that appeared to have been abandoned without a fight. Many believed the Persians had panicked. Others assumed the enemy had retreated deeper into their own territory. Excitement began to replace caution. The warriors celebrated what looked like an effortless victory. Weapons were laid aside. Horses were allowed to rest. The feast that Cyrus had carefully arranged now became irresistible. The roasted meat was eaten eagerly. The baskets of bread were emptied. Then came the wine. To the Persians, wine was a familiar part of courtly life and military celebrations. To many of the Massagetae, however, its strength was unfamiliar. Herodotus specifically notes that they were more accustomed to simpler drinks and had little experience with wine in such quantities. They drank freely. At first, laughter filled the camp. Voices grew louder. The tension of the approaching war seemed to disappear. For a brief moment, the warriors believed fortune had smiled upon them. What they did not realize was that every moment of celebration was unfolding exactly as Cyrus had planned. As the wine took effect, discipline faded. Guards became less attentive. Conversations replaced vigilance. Some warriors fell asleep where they sat. Others wandered through the camp with little awareness of the danger surrounding them. The experienced fighters who had approached with such caution only hours earlier were no longer prepared for battle. Hidden beyond the horizon, Persian scouts watched and waited. When they saw that the trap had fully taken hold, they raced back to Cyrus. The message was simple. The time had come. Without delay, the Persian army turned and marched back toward the camp. This time, there would be no retreat, no negotiation, only attack. The silence of the morning was shattered by the thunder of thousands of marching feet and galloping horses. Before many of the Massagetae even understood what was happening, Persian soldiers were pouring into the camp from every direction. Confusion erupted instantly. Some warriors reached for weapons that were no longer within arm's reach. Others struggled to stand after drinking heavily. Commands were shouted across the camp, but many could no longer hear them over the chaos. The organized force that had entered the Persian camp only hours earlier had become a scattered collection of surprised warriors. The Persians showed no hesitation. Archers released volleys of arrows into the crowded camp. Infantry advanced with shields locked together. Cavalry swept around the perimeter, cutting off every possible escape route. The battle was brief and devastating. Many of the Massagetae were killed before they could mount their horses. Others fought desperately despite the overwhelming confusion. Some managed to break through the Persian lines and flee across the steppe, carrying news of the disaster back to Queen Tomyris. But countless others never escaped. Among those captured alive was the commander of the expedition, Prince Spargapises. Bound in chains, the son of Queen Tomyris was taken before the Persian king. For Cyrus, the trap had achieved exactly what he had hoped. Without risking a major battle, He had destroyed a significant force of the Massagetae and captured the heir to their queen. It was a remarkable tactical success. Yet it was also the moment that transformed a border conflict into something deeply personal. Until now, Tomyris had fought to defend her homeland. Now, she would soon be fighting for something far more powerful than territory. She would be fighting for her son, and before long, the grief of a mother would become the fury that changed the course of history. The battle was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Where laughter and celebration had echoed through the Persian camp only hours before, silence now settled over the battlefield. The feast had become a massacre. The ground was strewn with broken weapons, abandoned shields, and the bodies of warriors who had believed they were celebrating a victory. Smoke drifted lazily into the sky as Persian soldiers gathered prisoners and searched the camp for survivors. For Cyrus, the operation had been an undeniable success. He had avoided a costly engagement. He had weakened the Massagetae without committing his entire army to a pitched battle. Most importantly, he now held one of the most valuable prisoners imaginable. Prince Spargapises, the son of Queen Tomyris. To any ruler of the ancient world, such a captive represented extraordinary leverage. Kings had ended wars over prisoners of far less importance. A royal heir could become a bargaining chip, a hostage, a means of forcing negotiations. Perhaps Cyrus believed the queen would now have little choice but to seek peace on his terms. If so, he misunderstood the woman he was facing. But before Tomyris learned of her son's capture, Spargapises himself would make a decision that neither army could undo. According to Herodotus, the prince had been taken alive after the battle, though he was no longer capable of resisting. Whether he had been wounded, overcome by exhaustion, or still suffering from the effects of the wine is uncertain. What is clear is that he awoke to a reality almost no warrior wished to face. He was no longer free. When consciousness returned, he found himself surrounded by Persian guards. His weapons were gone. His horse was gone. The battle had been lost. For a prince raised among the Massagetae, captivity was more than personal humiliation. It was a burden carried by his entire people. Among the nomadic warriors of the steppe, freedom was inseparable from honor. To live under another ruler's control was almost unimaginable. The open plains had shaped their identity for generations. They answered to no foreign king. They paid tribute to no empire. Now the son of their queen sat in the custody of the very man who sought to conquer them. Ancient writers offer only a brief account of what happened next, but its impact would echo throughout history. Spargapises asked Cyrus for one thing. He requested that his bonds be removed. Perhaps he wished to speak freely. Perhaps he hoped to demonstrate that he accepted his defeat. Or perhaps he simply wanted to die with dignity. Whatever his reason, Cyrus granted the request. The chains were taken away. For a brief moment, the prince was no longer restrained. Then, without hesitation, he took his own life. Herodotus does not dwell on the details, and neither should we. What matters is why the act became so significant. To Spargapises, death was preferable to living as a captive. His final decision reflected the values with which he had been raised, values shared by many warriors of the steppe, who believed that honor could outlive the body itself. The Persians had won the battle, but the prince they hoped to use as a political advantage was gone. News travels quickly in times of war. Long before official messengers arrived, rumors were already spreading across the grasslands. Survivors from the disastrous battle rode day and night to reach the camps of the Massagetae. Their horses were exhausted. Many carried wounds. Others had lost friends, brothers, or fathers in the ambush. Each told the same story: the abandoned Persian camp, the feast, the wine, the sudden attack, the slaughter, and finally, the capture of Prince Spargapises. When the first survivors reached Queen Tomyris, they struggled to find the words. Some spoke through tears. Others stared silently at the ground, unable to meet their queen's eyes. No commander ever wishes to deliver news like this. Tomyris listened without interrupting. She wanted every detail. How many had escaped? How many had fallen? Where had the Persians struck? How had the trap unfolded? Only after hearing the entire account did she ask the question that mattered most. "My son, is he alive?" The answer at first brought a fragile sense of hope. Yes, he had been captured. Captured was not dead. Prisoners could sometimes be exchanged. Negotiations were still possible. For one brief moment, a mother's heart may have clung to that possibility. Then another messenger arrived. This one carried the news no parent ever wishes to hear. Spargapises was dead. The prince had taken his own life rather than remain a prisoner of Persia. No ancient source describes Tomyris' immediate reaction. History leaves that moment to our imagination. Perhaps she closed her eyes in silence. Perhaps she wept in private, away from her warriors. Perhaps she stood motionless, refusing to let anyone see her grief. Whatever happened, one thing is certain. The loss was not merely political. It was deeply personal. Before she was a queen, she was a mother. Every victory her son had celebrated, every lesson she had taught him, every hope she had carried for his future, had ended on a foreign battlefield. For a time, grief overshadowed everything else. Even the strongest leaders are still human. No crown can shield a parent from loss. No throne can lessen the pain of losing a child. Yet history often remembers those who find purpose within tragedy. Tomyris eventually rose from her mourning with a clarity that surprised even those closest to her. The Persians had not simply defeated one of her armies. They had entered her homeland through deception. They had destroyed her warriors while they were vulnerable. And now her son was gone. The conflict had crossed a line from which there could be no return. She summoned the chiefs of the Massagetae once more. The atmosphere inside the council was entirely different from before. There was no longer any discussion about preserving peace, no debate over diplomacy. Everyone understood that the war had changed. Tomyris addressed the gathering with a calm that concealed enormous sorrow. She reminded them that she had given Cyrus every opportunity to avoid bloodshed. She had rejected his attempt to absorb her kingdom through marriage. She had urged him to return to Persia peacefully. She had respected him enough to offer him a choice. He had ignored every warning. Now, she declared, the responsibility for everything that followed belonged to him. According to Herodotus, Tomyris sent one final message to Cyrus. Unlike her earlier appeal, this message carried no invitation to negotiate. It carried a promise. She accused Cyrus of achieving his victory not through courage, but through trickery. She condemned the deception that had claimed the lives of her warriors and her son. Then she spoke words that would become some of the most famous in ancient history. She vowed that if Cyrus refused to leave her land, she would satisfy his thirst for blood. It was not the language of blind rage. It was the declaration of a ruler who believed justice demanded an answer. When the Persian king received the message, he knew there would be no further negotiations. The time for diplomacy had ended. Ahead lay only battle. Across the steppe, preparations intensified on both sides. The Massagetae gathered warriors from scattered tribes. Messengers rode across the plains, calling every able fighter to defend their homeland. Veteran horsemen sharpened arrows. Blacksmiths repaired armor worn smooth by years of use. Families embraced husbands, sons, and brothers, uncertain who would return. The Persian camp was equally active. Commanders reviewed battle plans. Scouts monitored the movement of Massagetae forces. Supply wagons continued to arrive, bringing everything the army would need for a decisive engagement. Both sides understood that the next battle would not resemble the first. There would be no hidden feast, no carefully prepared trap, no element of surprise. The armies would meet face to face. The outcome would be decided by courage, discipline, and determination alone. For Cyrus, it was another campaign in a lifetime filled with victories. For Tomyris, it had become something far greater. She was no longer fighting only to protect her kingdom. She was carrying the grief of a mother, the anger of a people who had been deceived, and the unshakable resolve of a queen who believed that freedom was worth any sacrifice. Beyond the rolling grasslands, two armies were now moving toward the same battlefield. One marched behind the banner of the greatest empire the world had ever known. The other followed a queen who had nothing left to lose. The clash that awaited them would become one of the bloodiest battles of the ancient world. And according to the oldest surviving account, it would bring the reign of Cyrus the Great to an unexpected and unforgettable end. The message from Queen Tomyris reached Cyrus exactly as she intended. There was no plea for mercy, no request for another round of negotiations, no attempt to soften her words. She had already offered peace. She had already warned him of the consequences. Now there was nothing left to discuss. According to Herodotus, her message was direct and unforgettable. She condemned the Persian king for winning his earlier victory through deception rather than open combat. Then she declared that if he refused to leave her land, she would give him all the blood he desired. It was a challenge unlike any Cyrus had received before. For years, kings had bowed before him. Some surrendered before the fighting even began. Others begged for favorable terms after their defeat. Tomyris did neither. She stood her ground, and she dared the most powerful ruler of the ancient world to face her army in an honest battle. Whether Cyrus felt anger, pride, or simple determination, we cannot know. The ancient sources remain silent on his personal thoughts, but his actions spoke clearly. He did not retreat. He did not seek compromise. Instead, he ordered the campaign to continue. The war would now be decided on the battlefield. Across the endless steppe, preparations intensified. The camps of the Massagetae became alive with activity from sunrise until long after darkness settled across the plains. Messengers rode tirelessly from tribe to tribe. Their horses, coated in dust, covered incredible distances every day. Each carried the same message. The queen was calling. Every warrior capable of carrying a bow or wielding a spear was needed. Families watched as fathers tightened the straps on their armor. Young men inspected arrows one final time before placing them into leather quivers. Experienced riders checked the hooves of their horses with the same care a soldier might sharpen his sword. Everyone understood what was coming. This would not be a border skirmish. This would be a battle that would decide whether the Massagetae remained free. Tomyris herself traveled among the warriors. Rather than hiding inside a protected command tent, she met the people she would soon lead into battle. She spoke with veteran fighters who had survived countless raids. She encouraged younger warriors preparing for their first true test. She stopped beside grieving families who had already lost loved ones during Cyrus's ambush. There were no grand speeches filled with impossible promises. She did not tell them that everyone would return home safely. She knew better. Instead, she reminded them why they were fighting. Not for treasure, not for glory, but for their homeland, for their families, for the freedom their ancestors had defended long before the Persian Empire ever existed. Those words carried weight because they came from someone who shared every risk. Tomyris would not remain behind the lines. Like many leaders of the steppe, she intended to ride with her warriors. That decision inspired confidence. A queen willing to face the same dangers as her soldiers earned a different kind of loyalty. Not loyalty born from fear, but loyalty born from respect. Meanwhile, the Persian camp was equally determined. Despite the success of the earlier ambush, Cyrus understood that the coming battle would be very different. Officers carefully organized their forces. Infantry units were placed where they could support one another. Archers inspected thousands of arrows. Cavalry commanders reviewed signals that would coordinate attacks across the open plain. Supply officers ensured that food and water would remain available even if the battle lasted far longer than expected. Years of campaigning had taught Cyrus one important lesson. Victories were rarely won by courage alone. Preparation often decided battles before the first sword was drawn. Yet there was something unusual about the mood within the Persian ranks. Many soldiers had fought beside Cyrus for decades. Together, they had crossed mountains, rivers, and deserts. They had defeated armies that seemed impossible to overcome. Confidence remained high, but confidence was not the same as certainty. Stories about the Massagetae had spread throughout the camp. The nomads were fearless horsemen. They could loose arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full speed. They knew the terrain better than anyone. Unlike armies defending cities, they had nowhere to retreat. If they lost this battle, they would lose everything. That made them especially dangerous. Veteran Persian commanders understood this well. An army defending its homeland often fought with extraordinary determination. As both forces moved closer together, the landscape itself seemed to hold its breath. The vast grasslands stretched endlessly in every direction. No towering walls interrupted the horizon. No forests concealed hidden armies. No rivers separated the approaching forces. Only open ground. It was a battlefield unlike those where Cyrus had earned his greatest victories. Here, neither side possessed the advantage of fortifications. Everything would depend on discipline, leadership, and endurance. Scouts from both armies constantly observed one another. Sometimes they could see enemy riders only as tiny figures moving against the distant horizon. Other times, they approached close enough to exchange arrows before disappearing once again. Each commander searched for weakness. Each hoped the other would make the first mistake. Days passed in tense anticipation. Neither side rushed into battle. Both understood the importance of choosing the right moment. Then at last, that moment arrived. As dawn broke over the steppe, the first rays of sunlight illuminated two armies facing one another across the open plain. For a few brief moments, everything remained still. Thousands of soldiers stood silently. The only sounds were the restless movements of horses and the wind sweeping across the grass. Many warriors glanced toward the faces beside them. Some whispered quiet prayers. Others tightened their grip on spear shafts worn smooth through years of training. Across the battlefield, Persian standards fluttered proudly above disciplined ranks of infantry. Opposite them stood the Massagetae. Their formations were less rigid. Their style of warfare relied on speed rather than strict order. But there was no mistaking their resolve. They had come to fight, and they had come prepared to die if necessary. Tomyris rode along the front of her army. She carried herself with calm determination. There was grief in her heart. No one could erase the loss of her son, but grief had become purpose. She looked across the battlefield toward the Persian lines. Somewhere beyond those ranks stood Cyrus, the man whose ambition had brought war to her homeland, the man she believed responsible for her son's death. This battle was no longer simply a struggle between two rulers. It had become a collision between two visions of the world. One believed that every frontier existed to be crossed. The other believed that some lands were worth defending at any cost. The silence ended suddenly. A horn echoed across the plain. Then another answered from the opposite side. Within seconds, thousands of horses surged forward. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath their hooves. Clouds of dust rose into the morning sky, partially hiding the advancing warriors. Archers on both sides released their first volleys. Dark waves of arrows arced overhead before crashing into shields, armor, and flesh. The first casualties fell almost immediately, but neither army slowed. The distance between them vanished with astonishing speed. Horsemen collided with horsemen. Spears shattered upon impact. Swords flashed beneath the rising sun. The air filled with the sounds of shouting, galloping horses, clashing metal, and cries of pain. Unlike the brief ambush that had claimed Spargapises, this battle became a brutal test of endurance. Neither side gained an immediate advantage. Again and again, cavalry charges slammed into opposing lines. Again and again, warriors fought hand-to-hand after exhausting their arrows. The open plains that had seemed so peaceful only hours earlier became covered with churned earth, broken weapons, and fallen soldiers. Persian discipline met the relentless mobility of the Massagetae. A counterattack answered every advance. Every breakthrough was fiercely contested. Neither army was willing to yield even a single stretch of ground. For hours, the battle raged beneath the burning sun. The outcome remained uncertain. Even experienced commanders struggled to understand who held the advantage. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance began to shift. The determination that had carried the Massagetae into battle was turning into something even more powerful. The warriors surrounding Queen Tomyris were no longer fighting merely to defend their homeland. They were fighting for fallen fathers, for fallen brothers, for Prince Spargapises, and for the promise their queen had made, the promise that Cyrus would answer for the blood that had already been spilled. As the fighting grew even more desperate, the Persian lines began to feel the relentless pressure. For the first time in many years, the army of Cyrus the Great was no longer advancing. It was beginning to give ground. And somewhere within the chaos of the battlefield, history was moving toward the moment that would define the legacy of both rulers forever. As the battle raged across the endless steppe, neither side could afford to hesitate. Every moment mattered. Every decision carried enormous consequences. The fighting had continued for hours, and the once green grasslands had become almost unrecognizable. Hooves had torn the earth into deep scars. Broken spears lay scattered among shattered shields. Clouds of dust drifted over the battlefield, making it difficult for soldiers to distinguish friend from foe. The air was thick with exhaustion. Persian soldiers, hardened by years of campaigning, had fought in countless wars. Many had survived battles in the mountains of Media. Others had marched through the deserts of Mesopotamia. Some had stood beside Cyrus during the conquest of Babylon itself. They were experienced, disciplined, loyal, but even the finest army has its limits. The Massagetae showed no sign of breaking. If anything, they seemed to grow more determined with every passing hour. Unlike the Persians, they were fighting on familiar ground. They knew every rise in the landscape. They understood how to move across the open plains without losing momentum. Their horse archers attacked relentlessly, galloping close enough to release volleys of arrows before turning away with astonishing speed. Whenever Persian cavalry attempted to pursue them, the Massagetae simply pulled them farther from the main battle, forcing them to fight on unfamiliar terrain. It was the kind of warfare the nomads had mastered over generations. Again and again, Persian commanders tried to restore order. Trumpets sounded across the battlefield. Officers shouted commands above the deafening roar of combat. Infantry tightened their formations, raising shields against the rain of arrows. Cavalry units regrouped before launching fresh charges. Each time they pushed forward, the Massagetae met them with equal determination. Neither army was willing to surrender the field. Yet as the afternoon wore on, subtle changes began to appear. The Persian advance slowed. What had once been disciplined formations became increasingly difficult to maintain. Long campaigns had taught Cyrus's soldiers how to endure hardship, but fatigue affects every army, no matter how experienced. Armor became heavier with every passing hour. Weapons felt more difficult to lift. The relentless heat of the open steppe drained strength from both men and horses. Across the battlefield, Tomyris recognized the moment. Years of leading her people had taught her that battles often turned not because of a single dramatic charge, but because one side finally reached the point of exhaustion. She raised her weapon high above her head. Her commanders immediately understood the signal. Fresh waves of Massagetae cavalry surged forward. War cries echoed across the plains as hundreds of riders accelerated toward the Persian lines. This attack carried a different energy. It was no longer designed merely to hold the enemy in place. It was intended to break them. The collision was devastating. Horsemen crashed into cavalry. Infantry struggled to withstand the renewed assault. Archers released arrows almost without pause. The pressure on the Persian army increased with every passing minute. For the first time since the campaign had begun, uncertainty spread through the ranks. Not panic, not yet, but uncertainty. Soldiers who had always believed Cyrus would find a way to victory suddenly realized something they had never imagined before. They could lose. Word spread quickly across the battlefield. The center was under enormous strain. The left flank was being forced backward. Messengers raced between commanders, carrying urgent instructions. Reserve units were committed to stabilize weakening positions. Still, the Massagetae continued pressing forward. Every warrior seemed driven by the same purpose. They remembered the ambush. They remembered the feast that had become a slaughter. They remembered Prince Spargapises. Their determination had become almost impossible to contain. At the heart of the Persian army, Cyrus remained where a king was expected to be. Ancient rulers often fought alongside their soldiers, believing that courage inspired loyalty. Cyrus had built his reputation not from behind palace walls, but on campaign after campaign beside his army. He was now an aging ruler, likely in his 60s, yet he continued to command from the battlefield. His presence steadied many of his soldiers. Whenever word spread that the king was still fighting, confidence briefly returned. The Persian line held, then it bent once more. The battle had become a contest of endurance, and every passing moment favored the defenders of the steppe. Tomyris understood that if Cyrus escaped this day, he would return with another army, another campaign, another attempt to conquer her people. The opportunity before her might never come again. She ordered her commanders to concentrate their attack where the Persian resistance remained strongest. The fiercest fighting erupted near the center of the battlefield. Warriors collided in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Swords rang against shields. Axes split wooden spear shafts. Horses screamed as they crashed into one another. Dust swallowed entire sections of the battlefield, making it nearly impossible to see what was happening only a short distance away. Within that chaos, Cyrus continued directing his army. No ancient source tells us exactly how he spent his final moments. There is no surviving eyewitness account describing the blow that struck him. No historian can say with certainty whether he fell to an arrow, a spear, or a sword. What we do know is that, according to Herodotus, somewhere amid the savage fighting, the founder of the Persian Empire was killed. It was a moment almost beyond belief. For decades, Cyrus had survived every campaign. He had defeated kings whose names once inspired fear across the ancient world. Many believed fortune itself favored him. Now, on a distant battlefield far from the great cities of his empire, the conqueror had finally fallen. At first, very few soldiers realized what had happened. The battle was simply too large. Dust obscured the field. Commanders were focused on surviving the next attack. But gradually, whispers began spreading through the Persian ranks. The king had fallen. Some refused to believe it. Others desperately searched for confirmation. When the truth became impossible to deny, the effect was immediate. The disciplined confidence that had carried the Persian army through countless victories began to unravel. An army can survive heavy casualties. It can recover from tactical mistakes. But the sudden loss of the commander, around whom the entire campaign revolves, often changes everything. Confusion spread from one unit to another. Officers struggled to reorganize their men. Signals became difficult to interpret. Orders arrived too late or not at all. Sensing the change, the Massagetae intensified their assault. They pressed forward without hesitation. Their cavalry swept around the Persian flanks, striking retreating formations before they could regroup. Archers continued firing into the disorganized ranks. The Persians fought bravely, but the battle was slipping beyond their control. Eventually, discipline gave way to survival. Small groups began withdrawing. Then larger formations followed. Before long, what had been an organized retreat became a desperate effort to escape the battlefield. Many soldiers fled toward the frontier. Others attempted to rescue wounded comrades before retreating. Some remained behind, fighting to protect the withdrawal of their fellow soldiers. The cost was enormous. Herodotus describes the engagement as one of the bloodiest battles fought between the Persians and the peoples of Central Asia. Modern historians cannot confirm the exact number of casualties, but there is little doubt that both armies suffered heavily. Victory had come at a terrible price. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the sounds of battle slowly faded. The grasslands fell strangely quiet. Only the cries of the wounded and the restless movements of riderless horses disturbed the silence. Queen Tomyris surveyed the battlefield. Around her lay the cost of war. Her people had won. Their homeland remained free. The greatest conqueror of the age was dead, yet no victory could erase what had been lost. Fathers would never return to their families. Mothers would mourn sons. Children would grow up without parents. And Tomyris herself still carried the grief that had first brought her to this battlefield. The death of Cyrus had ended the war, but for the queen, one final promise remained unfulfilled. She had sworn that the man responsible for her son's death would answer for his actions. Somewhere among the countless fallen, the body of Cyrus the Great still lay, And before the day was over, Queen Tomyris would perform the act that transformed a military victory into one of history's most enduring legends. The battle was over, but the silence that followed felt almost as heavy as the fighting itself. Across the vast steppe, the wind carried the smell of dust, smoke, and blood. The cries of wounded men echoed across the plain as survivors searched desperately for friends, brothers, and fathers who had vanished in the chaos. Only hours earlier, thousands of warriors had charged across these grasslands. Now, many would never leave them. Victory belonged to the Massagetae, but it had come at an enormous cost. Queen Tomyris rode slowly across the battlefield. She did not celebrate. There were no songs of triumph, no joyful cheers, no grand declaration that the war had been won. She had lived long enough to understand what every experienced commander eventually learns. There are no perfect victories. Every battle leaves empty places around campfires. Every triumph creates new grief for someone else. As her horse moved carefully among the fallen, warriors stepped aside in silence. Some lowered their heads as she passed. Others watched her with quiet respect. They had followed her into what had seemed an impossible battle against the greatest empire on earth. And somehow they had prevailed. Yet Tomyris' thoughts were elsewhere. She had not forgotten the promise she made before the battle. She had sworn that Cyrus would answer for what had happened to her people, for the warriors who had died in the Persian trap, for the deception that had claimed so many lives, and above all, for her son, Prince Spargapises. The grief of losing him had never left her. It had simply become quieter, hidden beneath the responsibilities of leadership. But now, standing on the battlefield where so many had fallen, those emotions returned with overwhelming force. She ordered her warriors to search among the Persian dead, not for treasure, not for trophies, for one man, Cyrus. The search lasted for hours. The battlefield was immense. Thousands of bodies covered the plains. Many soldiers had fallen far from their original formations. Armor, broken weapons, and abandoned equipment made identification difficult. Groups of Massagetae warriors moved methodically across the field, examining every fallen Persian officer. As the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, one group finally stopped. Word spread quickly. They had found him. The body of Cyrus the Great lay among his soldiers. The man who had built the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. The conqueror who had defeated mighty kingdoms. The ruler whose name had inspired fear across 3 continents. Now rested in silence on the very frontier he had hoped to conquer. Tomyris approached slowly. No ancient source tells us what she felt in that moment. History rarely preserves private emotions. It records actions, not thoughts. Perhaps she remembered the marriage proposal that had begun this conflict. Perhaps she thought of the warnings she had sent, the opportunities she had given him to turn back, the peace he could have chosen. Or perhaps she saw only the face of the man whose ambition had taken her son from her forever. According to the account recorded by Herodotus, Tomyris ordered that Cyrus's head be severed from his body. It was a shocking act. Even in the ancient world, where warfare was often brutal, such a gesture carried deep symbolic meaning. But the queen was not finished. Herodotus writes that she then ordered a leather wineskin, or possibly a large skin used as a container, to be filled with human blood. Standing before the fallen conqueror, she placed Cyrus's head into the blood-filled vessel. Then, according to the historian, she spoke words that would echo across more than 2,000 years of history. You thirsted for blood? So now drink your fill. Whether those were her exact words, no one can know. The original account survives only through ancient writers recording events decades later. Yet the image itself became unforgettable. The greatest conqueror of his age, defeated by the one ruler who refused to surrender. A king whose endless campaigns had brought bloodshed across the ancient world, now symbolically forced to drink the very thing he had pursued. For generations, that scene would capture the imagination of historians, artists, poets, and storytellers alike. It was dramatic, powerful, and impossible to forget. But it also raises an important question. Did it really happen? The answer is more complicated than many people realize. Herodotus, writing several decades after Cyrus's death, presents this story as the account he found most convincing. However, he was not the only ancient historian to describe the Persian king's final days. Other writers preserved different traditions. Some claimed Cyrus died fighting another nomadic tribe. Others suggested he died under entirely different circumstances. None of these accounts can be confirmed with complete certainty. The battlefield itself left no written record. The people who witnessed the fighting preserved their memories through oral tradition. By the time those stories reached historians, details had almost certainly changed. That does not mean Herodotus invented the story, nor does it guarantee that every detail is historically accurate. Instead, his account reflects how many people in the ancient world remembered the conflict. And sometimes, the stories people choose to remember reveal as much about history as the facts themselves. For the Massagetae, whether every detail happened exactly as described mattered less than what the story represented. It was the triumph of independence over empire, the victory of a queen who refused to bow before the most powerful ruler of her age, the fulfillment of a promise made by a grieving mother. As darkness slowly settled across the steppe, the surviving warriors began gathering their dead. Campfires burned quietly beneath the evening sky. Families would soon begin mourning those who had not returned. The Persian survivors, meanwhile, retreated toward the empire that Cyrus had spent nearly 30 years building. They carried with them devastating news. The empire had lost its founder, its architect, its greatest conqueror. News of Cyrus's death would soon travel from one end of the Persian Empire to the other, leaving nobles, generals, and ordinary citizens asking the same question: what would happen now? Yet even as Persia prepared for a future without Cyrus, another story had already begun to spread across the ancient world. The story of a queen, a warrior, a mother, a ruler who had stood before history's greatest conqueror and refused to kneel. It is a story that has survived for more than 25 centuries. But separating the legend from the historical truth is a challenge that historians continue to wrestle with even today. And that is where our story turns next. The story of Queen Tomyris and Cyrus the Great has survived for more than 2,500 years. It has been told around campfires, recorded by ancient historians, painted by Renaissance artists, retold in books, documentaries, and classrooms across the world. Yet after hearing this extraordinary story, one question naturally remains: how much of it is history, and how much is legend? To answer that question, we have to leave the battlefield behind and step into the world of the ancient historians, the men whose writings preserved this remarkable encounter long after the warriors themselves had vanished. Our primary source is the Greek historian Herodotus. Often called the father of history, Herodotus traveled widely during the 5th century BCE, gathering stories from soldiers, merchants, priests, and travelers. His work remains one of the most important surviving accounts of the ancient world. But Herodotus was also honest about something many modern readers overlook. He did not claim to witness these events himself. In several places throughout his writings, he openly admits that different people told different versions of the same story. His role, as he saw it, was to record those traditions and explain which one he believed was the most credible. When writing about Cyrus's death, Herodotus acknowledged that multiple accounts already existed. He simply chose the one he found most convincing. That is the version we have followed throughout this story. According to Herodotus, Cyrus invaded the lands of the Massagetae, deceived part of their army through the abandoned camp and wine-filled feast, captured Prince Spargapises, provoked Queen Tomyris' fury, and was ultimately killed in a massive battle. Afterward, Tomyris fulfilled her promise by placing his head into a container filled with blood. It is one of the most memorable endings in all of ancient history. But it is not the only one. Other ancient writers preserve different traditions. The historian Ctesias, who served at the Persian court generations after Cyrus, described the king dying during a campaign against another Central Asian people known as the Derbices. In his version, Cyrus was wounded during battle, and died several days later after speaking with his family and his commanders. Another tradition, preserved by the historian Xenophon, presents an entirely different ending. In his work, Cyropedia, Cyrus dies peacefully in his palace after growing old, surrounded by members of his family. Before his death, he delivers a lengthy speech offering advice on leadership, morality, and the future of his empire. It is a dignified conclusion. But there is one important detail modern historians always remember. The Cyropedia was never intended to be a strict historical record. Xenophon wrote it partly as a philosophical work about the ideal ruler. His goal was not simply to document history, but to explore what good leadership should look like. Because of that, most scholars treat his account differently from Herodotus's narrative. So which version is correct? The honest answer is, no one knows for certain. The further we travel back into antiquity, the fewer written records survive. Many official Persian documents from Cyrus's reign have been lost forever. The Massagetae themselves left behind almost no written histories. What remains are fragments preserved by people writing years or sometimes decades after the events. Modern archaeology has answered many questions about the Persian Empire. It confirms Cyrus's existence. It confirms the extraordinary size of the empire he created. It confirms his reputation as one of history's greatest rulers. But archaeology has not yet uncovered evidence that definitively explains exactly how he died. For historians, uncertainty is not failure. It is simply part of studying the ancient world. Sometimes the evidence allows us to speak with confidence. Sometimes it does not. The story of Tomyris reminds us of that reality. There are elements that most historians accept with reasonable confidence. Cyrus almost certainly died while campaigning somewhere in Central Asia around 530 BCE. His death occurred far from the imperial capitals of Persia. His son, Cambyses II, succeeded him as king and continued expanding the empire. Beyond those broad facts, however, certainty becomes much more difficult. Yet perhaps the greater question is not whether every dramatic detail happened exactly as Herodotus described. Perhaps the more important question is why this story survived at all. History remembers countless battles. Most have been forgotten. It remembers thousands of kings. Many are little more than names carved into stone. But the story of Tomyris endured. Why? Part of the answer lies in its remarkable reversal. The greatest conqueror of his age meets someone who cannot be intimidated. An empire that had swallowed nations encounters a people who refuse to surrender. A queen stands against the most powerful man alive, and according to one of history's oldest accounts, she wins. It is the kind of story people remember because it challenges expectations. Yet Tomyris's legacy extends beyond the battlefield. For centuries, she became a symbol of resistance against overwhelming power. Artists across Europe painted the dramatic moment described by Herodotus, often portraying her holding the head of Cyrus as a warning against unchecked ambition. Writers celebrated her courage. Poets transformed her into a symbol of justice. In more recent centuries, she has become an important historical figure throughout Central Asia, where many view her as an enduring example of leadership, independence, and national pride. Her name continues to appear in literature, museums, monuments, films, and historical discussions. For many people, Tomyris represents something timeless: the determination to protect one's homeland, the courage to confront a stronger enemy, the willingness to keep fighting even after unimaginable personal loss. Cyrus, meanwhile, left behind a legacy every bit as remarkable. His empire did not collapse after his death. Instead, it continued to grow. Under his successors, especially Cambyses II and later Darius I, the Achaemenid Empire expanded into one of the largest and most influential empires in human history. Its administrative systems shaped future civilizations. Its roads connected distant cultures. Its policies of respecting local traditions influenced rulers for centuries afterward. Even today, Cyrus is remembered not only as a conqueror, but also as a remarkable statesman. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered more than 2,000 years after his death, has often been described as an early expression of royal tolerance because it records his policies after the conquest of Babylon. While modern scholars debate exactly how it should be interpreted, it remains one of the most important surviving artifacts from his reign. In the end, history remembers both rulers, not because one defeated the other, but because each represented something larger than themselves. Cyrus embodied ambition, vision, and the extraordinary ability to unite diverse peoples beneath a single empire. Tomyris embodied independence, resilience, and the refusal to surrender even when facing overwhelming odds. Whether every detail of their final encounter happened exactly as Herodotus described may never be known. What cannot be questioned is the impact their story has had. For more than 25 centuries, people have continued asking the same questions. Could the world's greatest conqueror really have fallen to a queen? Did Tomyris truly keep her promise? Or has legend simply become inseparable from history? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between the two, because sometimes the stories that endure are not those that tell us every fact. They are the ones that reveal enduring truths about human nature, the dangers of unchecked ambition, the cost of war, the strength born from grief, and the extraordinary courage of those who refuse to surrender their freedom, long after the armies disappeared into history. Long after the grasslands covered the scars of battle, the names of Cyrus the Great and Queen Tomyris continued to echo through the centuries. One built an empire that transformed the ancient world. The other defended her people so fiercely that history could never forget her. And together, they left behind one of antiquity's most powerful and enduring stories. History has a curious way of deciding who will be remembered. Some rulers build magnificent cities only for their names to fade into obscurity. Others command vast armies, yet leave behind little more than broken ruins and forgotten inscriptions. And then there are those rare figures whose stories refuse to disappear, not because every detail can be proven, but because their lives continue to ask questions that every generation must answer for itself. Queen Tomyris and Cyrus the Great belong to that rare company. More than 25 centuries have passed since their armies met on the windswept plains of Central Asia. The horses have long since stopped running. The weapons have rusted away. The camps have vanished beneath layers of earth and grass. Yet the questions raised by their conflict remain surprisingly modern. How far should ambition go? When does expansion become conquest? Can military brilliance ever justify endless war? And what is the true price of victory? These are questions every civilization eventually faces. Cyrus the Great was, without question, one of the most extraordinary rulers in human history. His achievements were real. He united peoples who had spent generations fighting one another. He created an empire stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the mountains of Central Asia. He established systems of government that influenced later empires for centuries. Many historians admire him not only for his military genius, but also for his ability to govern a diverse empire with remarkable pragmatism. Unlike many conquerors who ruled through fear alone, Cyrus often allowed conquered peoples to keep their customs, religions, and local traditions. It was one reason his empire remained remarkably stable after his victories. Even those who opposed him frequently acknowledged his intelligence. His name became synonymous with leadership. Yet even the greatest leaders have limits. Cyrus spent much of his life pushing beyond every frontier placed before him. Each victory opened the door to another campaign. Each conquest revealed another kingdom beyond the horizon. Success became momentum. Momentum became expectation. Eventually, the empire reached the edge of the great Eurasian steppe. Beyond it lived people who had little interest in becoming part of someone else's empire. The Massagetae did not possess richer cities. They did not command larger armies. They did not have greater resources. What they possessed was something far more difficult to conquer: the determination to remain free. That determination found its greatest expression in Queen Tomyris. Unlike many rulers remembered primarily for conquest, Tomyris is remembered because she defended rather than expanded. She did not march into Persia seeking new lands. She did not dream of ruling distant nations. Everything we know about her suggests that her goal was remarkably simple. Protect her people, protect their independence, protect the way of life they had inherited. It is perhaps one of history's greatest ironies. The ruler with the smaller kingdom has often become the larger symbol. Across Central Asia, Tomyris is remembered not merely as a queen. She is remembered as a defender, a woman who refused to allow fear to dictate her decisions, a leader who faced the most powerful empire of her age and chose resistance over surrender. That image has inspired generations. In modern Kazakhstan, monuments honor her memory. Artists continue to paint her story. Authors continue to write about her. Filmmakers have brought her life to the screen, introducing her to entirely new audiences. Every generation seems to rediscover her in its own way. Cyrus, too, continues to inspire. His tomb, standing near the ancient Persian capital of Pasargadae, remains one of the most important historical sites associated with the Achaemenid Empire. For visitors who stand before its simple stone structure, it serves as a reminder of how even the greatest rulers eventually become part of history. Empires rise, empires fall, but ideas often outlive them all. Perhaps that is why historians continue debating the final battle. Not because they enjoy uncertainty, but because they understand that history is rarely as simple as heroes and villains. Cyrus was neither a monster nor a flawless king. Tomyris was neither merely a grieving mother nor simply a victorious queen. Both were leaders shaped by the demands of their time. Both believed they were protecting something worth fighting for. Their choices collided on a battlefield where compromise had become impossible. That complexity is what makes the story endure. It reminds us that history is made by human beings, people with hopes, with fears, with families, with dreams that sometimes lead them toward greatness, and sometimes toward tragedy. When we read ancient history, it is tempting to imagine its figures as larger-than-life legends. Statues carved from stone, names written in dusty books, but they were real people. Cyrus likely experienced the same uncertainty before battle that every commander has known. Tomyris almost certainly felt the crushing grief of losing her son before leading her people into one final fight. The soldiers who rode beside them were not names in a history book. They were fathers, daughters, brothers, friends, people who hoped to return home. Many never did. That is the hidden truth behind every ancient victory. History often remembers the names of kings and queens. Time is less kind to ordinary people, yet they are the ones who paid the highest price. Perhaps that is the lesson this story leaves us with. Power can build empires, courage can defend nations, but war always demands a cost that no victory can fully repay. The grasslands where Tomyris and Cyrus once fought have changed countless times over the centuries. Seasons have come and gone. Empires have risen and disappeared. Generations have lived, loved, and passed away. Nature has quietly erased the scars of battle, but memory has not. As long as people continue asking questions about leadership, about ambition, about freedom, and about the choices that shape history, the names of Queen Tomyris and Cyrus the Great will continue to be spoken, not simply because one defeated the other, but because together they remind us of something timeless. No empire lasts forever. No victory is without sacrifice. And sometimes, the smallest kingdom can leave the greatest mark on history. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of the ancient world's most fascinating stories.